Thank you everyone for coming. For those of you who don't know, my name is Adrian Marshall. I'm the facilitator of the Grassy Plains Network. And if you don't really know the Grassy Plains Network, perhaps because you've come via the VNPA website and so on, we advocate for the protection of grasslands, mostly in and around Melbourne, but also more broadly across Victoria. And we have twin goals of advocacy and community engagement. Yes, I'd like to, before we go much further, I'd like to just say I'm on Wurundjeri country here, and like to pay my respect to Wurundjeri elders, past, present, and emerging, but also give my respect more broadly, I suppose, to all the First Nations peoples across Victoria who have done such a magnificent job of making and keeping our grasslands as glorious as they are, and the sad fact that we have managed to trash them in a brief couple of centuries is, yes, well, it's on us, and I hope we can get a collective act together to help right that that wrong, I suppose. Okay, so tonight we're extremely lucky to have John Morgan talking to us, professor at Trobe University. John is probably one of Australia's most respected grassland ecologists, probably just ecologists full stop there. And John, he's got a couple of specialties, alpine flora being one, alpine ecosystems, subalpine ecosystems. You please protect me when I make a hash of this, John, and grasslands in general. And tonight he's talking about a particularly favourite subject of his, which he calls inch-flora. So, John, without any more ado, please take over.
Thanks, Adrian. That's a lovely welcome, and welcome to everyone who's here tonight. Thank you for coming along. It's going to be a weird and wonderful journey into a plant group that has frankly been overlooked in grasslands broadly, but probably just in general, really. So we need to start at the beginning. Now, some of you may not know what an inch is. I don't know if we've got that sort of demographic, Adrian, but for those of you who don't know what an inch is, Adrian, do you know what an inch is?
I know what an inch is, yes, but I am in that demographic. You're right, John. We do.
It's about 2.5 through 2 centimeters. So let's get our bearings. Here's a HB pencil. I'll go that way. There we go. That pencil, do it that way. There we go. Is about 15 centimeters. That's the height of a plains wanderer, one of the birds, the really special birds that you find in grasslands. So they're pretty small birds if you think about it. Very endangered because of their habitat loss and their peculiar affinity with certain types of grasslands. So an inch-flora, we'll just turn the pencil upside down. That's the little bit that I've sharpened at the end there, the bit that's about so big. There we go there, the little bit on top. So the inch-flora are small plants, and as a consequence have been largely overlooked in grasslands because they're hard to see. So I'm going to do a bit of a whirlwind tour about the morphology, the biology and the ecology of annual plant species relevant to grasslands in our part of the world, but a bit broader through Western and Northwestern Victoria as well. And so I hope you enjoy the little journey we're going to take tonight, and more than happy that we have some questions at the end, and you might want to put them in the chat box as you go so you remember your questions. Okay, so inch plants we're going to talk about today are annuals. And again, probably most of you are aware of what we're talking about, but an annual is a plant that undertakes its life cycle within one season, and invariably a very short season, matter of months. So we're pretty familiar with annuals. If you grow sunflowers, amazingly, that's an annual, this massive plant that grows 2.5, 3 meters tall. So annuals can be huge in many respects. But we're going to be talking about a group of plants that's very small. But in some respects, the type of plant I'm going to focus on tonight is more like an insect, because insects, such as this black field cricket, completes its lifespan in a very short period of time. It emerges from the soil in spring, it grows, it breeds, lays its eggs, and it dies. So in many respects, it's just like an annual plant. It's got a short window of opportunity. It needs to leave lots of offspring behind to be successful, and then it leaves the scene, never to be seen again as that particular individual. And so annual plants have the same kind of life cycle. Being an annual is really a dumb idea for a plant, really dumb, because there are a lot of challenges if you're going to be annual. So let's think of the world's smallest flowering plant. It's a thing called Wolffia. And it's in the same family, plant family, Araceae, that those, you might have indoor plants, spathiphyllums, the big white spathe, and it's got often a yellow flowering thing in the middle. That's in the same family. So there's Wolffia. It's pretty small dimensions. It actually has the Guinness Book of World Records as the smallest flowering plant on record. And yet somehow that's successful. And you'll wonder why. Well, we'll talk about that. But it's got some challenges. Now, this particular plant is called duckweed, actually, so it grows in ponds. But it's 165,000 times shorter than the world's tallest flowering plant. So isn't it amazing how evolution has driven tiny plants and enormously tall plants? So at this early stage, we might think, yeah, it hasn't got much going for it, has it? It's actually 7 trillion times lighter than the giant redwoods in California. So there's something going on here. You have to have an advantage of being an annual, at least in some environments, because you're clearly not very well advantaged in other environments where you've got these massive long-lived organisms. So I find them really challenging and interesting from that perspective. Why would they go down this track? Here's just a sort of a close-up, it's almost like under a microscope. In fact, it is under a microscope to look at Wolffia, and just to put it into comparison to the world's tallest flowering plants, the Eucalyptus regnans, mountain ash from up near King Lake. And hopefully you'll be able to see, just to make out how big that tree is, there's the top of a coach, you know, a 52-seater coach. So they're pretty tall trees. And yet this plant over here, and we can see probably a dozen plants in that field of view, is highly successful. In many respects, sad as this might seem, the Wolffia is a far more successful plant than mountain ash will ever be. So there must be some key advantages to being an annual and to being tiny in this case as well. It's not just about being tiny. Some annuals, like this pussy tails or featherheads, and you might be aware of the perennial type of featherheads that you get close to Melbourne in grasslands, a thing called Tylotus macrocephalus, large flowering. This is Tylotus xerophyllus, grows in dry environments, as you can see from that map there. It's an enormous plant. So its challenge as an annual is to grow fast enough in a really short period of time so that it can put up these flowering heads, pump all this pollen out, and hopefully produce tens of thousands, if not millions of seeds. So there must be an advantage to doing that. And it's pretty obvious what that advantage is going to be. In environments all over the world that have very seasonal conditions, like a distinct winter rainfall period, summer drought, or vice versa, and you can see them here plotted across the globe, they tend to be at sort of 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south of the equator. Remembering that the equator, it's pretty much tropical and wet a lot of the time. When you get these environments, annuals proliferate because their advantage is they can be dormant for most of the year and see out that tough time when there's no water around. And then when there's a sprinkling of rain at the right time of year, whether that be autumn or summer, depending on what sort of climate you live in, then you can germinate, you can grow quickly, you can reproduce just like those black field crickets and then die and complete your life cycle in that period when conditions are favourable. So this is a really characteristic type of plant in what we might call Mediterranean type climates, so distinct winter rainfall periods, or the equivalent in the monsoonal sort of summer rain periods. So if we then zoom into Australia, we can see Australia there already, but if we zoom into sort of Victoria and Australia, we can again divide those plants that flower and seed in summer versus in winter spring. And in Victoria, we fall comfortably within the winter spring active period. That might be changing. You've all probably noticed this, that we're getting shifts to rain in summer much more than potentially in winter. There seems to be a shift going on. So this might actually have a pretty profound implication on the germination and growth of annual plants that are evolved and adapted to a winter-spring lifestyle down here. So that's where we can find them in Victoria, is mostly west of Melbourne and to the northwest. I can't tell you how many annuals there are in the Victorian flora because I haven't been through the whole flora and counted them all up, so the total number of native species. But I can tell you for the volcanic plains grasslands just to the west of Melbourne, there are about 42 annual forbs, and a forb is a wildflower. It's not a grass, it's not a shrub or a tree, it's what we'd call the showy wildflower component. So only 42 species. That doesn't sound like very many, but I guess it's what they represent is what's important here, a lifestyle in this ecosystem for which we've mostly overlooked them. Unfortunately, if you think about what sort of plants have invaded into our native ecosystems, so exotic species, about 37% of all exotic species in Victoria are annuals. So they're probably occupying a niche that hasn't been well occupied by the native species. Maybe they're jumping into areas because of disturbance and then proliferating and taking over those habitats. And I find this really fascinating. It's like it's really obvious and really easy for the exotics to move in. So why aren't there more natives? And that's a topic we will return to a little bit later. So 42 that we know of. That's forbs of the sedges and grasses and the rushes. There's a whole bunch of other species as well, but we're not really going to touch on those. They're not the so showy elements of the annuals, the inch-flora. So habitats become pretty important. Like what sort of habitat might we expect to see inch-flora? Well, they have to be in habitats where there are not many other plants because these are small plants. And when they emerge each autumn or winter, they emerge into an environment that if it's occupied by lots of other species, they're going to be really challenged to grow, flower. So we often see them in what we call herb-rich woodlands. And that really just means they don't have many grasses in them. So herbs are quite compatible with these annual inch-flora. You can see in the bottom right there, they're okay in ecosystems that have spotty shrubs. So both of those, or all of those photos are taken around up near Ararat. So right outside the edge of the Victorian volcanic plain, but not far off it in open habitat types. It's no surprise, perhaps, that the inch-flora is really common in semi-arid and arid ecosystems because water is really limiting in those environments, and hence there's lots of space that's free and occupiable when the rains come and the annuals can germinate. So it's no surprise you see in mallee ecosystems, they're well represented. We often see them in environments where what we call the biological soil crust or the cryptogamic crust, crypto meaning hidden or hard to see. So this crust, which is composed of things such as lichens, they're the big white foliose lichens you can see in this photo, and there's lots of mosses in here as well. They're the more greener and sort of darker coloured organisms in this environment. The inch-flora is often really common in these environments. And one of the reasons is because they're quite stable environments. The reason the cryptogams have colonized these surfaces is because they're not getting out-competed. A bit like the inch-flora, they're in stable environments where they can be successful and there's not much leaf litter, there's not many plants to out-compete them, and so they tend to be really good places for inch-flora as well. So you tend to find cryptogams in grasslands, particularly on red soils. Red soil grasslands on the Victorian volcanic plain and also on the northern plains to the north of Bendigo, are really infertile, seem to be really tough places for plants to grow. And you get these very open ecosystems, often with cryptogams and covered in inch-flora. And I think for the Victorian volcanic plains, this might have been the stronghold for the annual flora before we came along with our grazing sheep and our cropping practices. So red soil grasslands are often the most diverse for plants, but I think they're all like perennial plants, but I think they're also really important for the annual flora. And it's because, again, they're emerging into an environment that's quite predictable. There's going to be lots of light, there's going to be lots of space, And it's predictable on a seasonal basis. Every year it's going to be pretty similar because there are not many grasses there to smother out all those tiny, tiny little plants. So what's not so suitable a habitat is pretty obvious, and we've just about touched on that. You tend not to ever find annuals in rainforests. It's just too dark in the understory for those little plants to capture enough light, germinate, grow, flower, set seed. There's just not enough energy there. And one of the added problems for rainforests is often there's a lot of leaf litter on the ground. So it would smother those little plants. On the right, we've got a more typical eucalypt forest. This is actually near my place up in the Dandenongs, and you see zero annuals in those environments because you've got too much leaf litter on the ground, not much light, but a bit more than in the rainforest. But there's actually lots of other ground story plants like shrubs, or in this case, wiregrass. So they're occupying all the space, and the little annuals can't get going in that environment. So they've got to be in the Goldilocks space of, it's not, well, in fact, it's not even the Goldilocks space, really. Where other things don't grow, they will tend to be pretty good. And so this is the kind of habitats we've lost throughout much of southeastern Australia because they're already open habitats, so they've been really amenable to agriculture. Whereas these types of habitats, you've got to cut them down, you've got to convert them for agriculture if that's what you want to do. So they take a bit more effort. So the annual plant habitat has been destroyed over much of its range, unfortunately. So I'm going to go through a whole bunch of annual plants now, because I thought it's about time we looked at some, and I'm going to get excited by some of them. I'm going to get started by all of them, actually, because I think they're just so cute. But you'll see some features over and over with the different annuals I'm about to show you. So we're going to start with the daisy family. Daisies are in the family Asteraceae, and wherever you see a VVP in brackets after the family name there, that means this is a known species of the Victorian volcanic plains. Now, I don't know if you know your plants of the Victorian volcanic plains west of Melbourne, but you might want to make mental notes whether you've actually seen any of these plants, because I'd really like to know about it, because they're really hard to find these days. So here's Melotia tenuifolia. So just to sort of remind you, this is the flowers up here. They're tiny little clusters of heads of flowers here, like tiny, 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 tiny little flowers. This is a tiny plant with tiny flowers. Here's a giveaway for you. Most of these little annuals can't afford the time to be visited by insects for pollination. Their flowers are too small and they're flowering for such a little period of time that we think most of these are either wind pollinated because they're growing in high densities, pollen just gets shunted around, or they're self-fertilizing. It's a really successful strategy if you want to grow seeds from a tiny little flower head that's not around for very long. So we'll see similarities in the form and function of these plants. Look at this little cutie, Siloxerus multiflorus. They're like little cabbages. So again, in the daisy family, and so the flowers are actually all inside here. We can't quite see them. For scale, here's one of the sundews. So if you thought a sundew was small, look how tiny these little things are. They're cute. And you can see one of the features of annual plants is they come up en masse, not as individuals, but rather as carpets. That's suggestive of there's germination cues. They all take advantage of it. Up they come, they do their thing, and they die. Also in the daisy family, Hyalosperma demissum. This time we can sort of look down a little bit into the flower head, and now we can actually see the flowers, but they're all tucked away behind all these white papery bracts. They're all just stuck in here. So they're not really conducive to being pollinated by insects. And there's so many of them, it's hardly likely that insects could get around to all these flowers. So we think a lot of them are probably self-pollinating. That can be pretty successful. It means you're going to produce lots of progeny. It just means that genetically, you're not going to be very diverse. Stuartina muelleri, how cute's that? And look at those flowers. They're daisies again, but the flower structure is really different again. One of the things you'll note with a lot of these plants as well, they're often silvery or hairy, or they're actually trying to reduce water loss. That's what that often means. And that's important because when you germinate and start growing, you don't want to dry out and be droughted because you've already made the decision to head to flowering and seeding as soon as you started to germinate. The growth periods correspond to often only 6 to 9 weeks. That's their lifespan each year, maybe 9 weeks to 12 weeks maximum. So once they germinate, there's no stopping them flowering. Oh, how cool is that? Triptylodiscus pygmaeus. Pygmaeus meaning small, of course. Again, hairy leaves, interesting. Another daisies. Now, these ones have a different sort of floral structure. You can see the heads now are a bit sort of flopping out, and there's more individual flower heads here. And I can see the styles. They're the little female reproductive bits that are hanging out at the end here, and they're waiting to receive, here they are here, waiting to receive some pollen. Good luck getting pollinated. So again, why wind pollen and maybe self-pollen is actually the norm here. Oh, now that's an Asteraceae. That's a daisy. That is an amazing plant. I mean, just look at how beautiful, look at how beautiful it is. Look at the grain size of the sand particles. It gives you an appreciation of how small this plant is. Look at the leaves. I don't even know what these things are. It looks like it's covered in dew, but it's actually not. These are excretions, like salt excretions, but I don't really know if they are. I don't really know what they are. It's one of my favorite plants. This is the head here. The head never opens. So we know this one is self-pollinating. It doesn't even open up like a normal daisy. So it's pretty amazing. Nephosis Drummondii. What a cutie. Oh, this is called camel dung. Actinobile, Ulganosa. Aren't they just fantastic? So these are the flowers here in the middle. Quite big, really. But again, they'll be consisting of lots and lots of flowers within each of these. Again, grain size of the sand and what have you kind of gives you an impression they're pretty small. Aren't they fantastic? When you find them, you tend to find a lot of them. Fun fact about these plants, after they've produced their seed or they've pollinated themselves, basically they just sit there. They don't release seed in a normal dispersal mode. These guys roll around after they disconnect from the ground, around here somewhere. It disconnects in sort of summer. They roll around, and as they're rolling around, the seeds start falling out. So they're dispersed by sort of roly-poly. There's no real term for that one. Bloody cute though. Oh, small again. Blenospora in the front there, out of focus. Can't even get it in focus. That's how small it is. And Melosia over to the left with the dangly bits. There's the flowers hanging out. I mean, how cute's this? No wonder we don't see them. These things you have to get on your hands and knees to see them. They are just the cutest things. And all the ones I'm showing you are in Victoria. Many of them are in the volcanic plains. These ones are not, but just sort of showing you the diversity of these things. Still daisies. So daisies are really well represented in this group of plants. Another slightly out of focus photo, Brachyscomia. You might know Brachyscomias. Normally they're big and they've got big purple outer florets. They're big and showy. You can buy them at Bunnings. And here we've got Brachyscomia purpusilla. Fantastic little plant. Again, many of them growing in a very small area. That one you can find on the VVP. Hyalosperma praecox. They got great names as well. Isn't that showy? That's beautiful. So that's your typical kind of paper daisy. So the outer white bracts there are not flowering parts at all. They're protective of the flower head itself. So here's the daisy flowers in the middle, again in a nice big head. They would actually grow probably almost to the height of my pencil. They're one of the big ones. They can grow 10 to 15 centimeters tall. So they've chosen, as it were, to get big and showy. Because again, the bracts are kind of pointless for a little annual. Like, what are they doing? What they're probably doing is protecting those flower heads from cold temperatures, cold mornings in winter. So from frost, really. Again, not a great photo. Rhodanthe pygmaea, one of these, again, paper daisy type plants. So we can see the little white bracts again. And inside those little white bracts will be these tiny, tiny little flowers. Got a question mark on that species. There are records for Rhodanthe pygmaea on the VVP, but we're not 100% certain of their absolute locality. Sometimes they just say Skipton. And so it could be on the VVP, but it could be off the VVP potentially as well. Another cutie. Oh, another Rhodanthe corymbifolia, again in the same boat. Thought to have probably been on the VVP, but not sure. Again, you can see that consistent sort of outer bract, the white, and then the flower heads in the middle. And in this case, they're multi-branching flowers, not just singular heads, as many of the other species are. So hopefully you're getting an appreciation of these things are really cute and really diverse, but we've got more. Sorry. Look at this guy here. It's all flower head. This is Myriacephalus rhizocephalus. So basically flowering down on right on the ground. So they're literally on the ground, those ones flowering. They're enormous flower heads for the size of the plant. So this plant's saying, when it germinates, I'm heading straight to flowering. My deal in life is to set seed, to reproduce, and obviously replace myself. And you have to say, they're probably pretty successful at it, because they are producing millions of seed in large populations, of which many of those are then translating into seedlings and obviously plants the following year. In some respects, they're way more successful than trees, if you just think about the numbers of individuals in a population. This is called the sticky longbeaks, Podotheca angustifolia. It's, again, a daisy. Look at that cute little daisy flower just at the top. And yet this is all flower here, like inside. This is the ovaries all the way down here, and the flowers are right at the very top. And so it's interesting, if they get fertilized up here, the pollen tube has to go all the way down here and fertilize the ovary. And you'll see in a moment why it does that. But aren't they just the cutest little things again? Unbelievably, Podolepis. Many of you might know Podolepis as a perennial grassland plant. You get beautiful Podolepis, showy Podolepis and basalt Podolepis, but you also get annual Podolepis. Isn't it just gorgeous? They do all of this within 12 weeks. Germinate, grow leaves, flower. I find them really fascinating. Okay, so we're going to get off the daisies now. I'm just going to touch on a couple of key other families in the inch-flora. One's in what's called the Centrolepidaceae. Don't worry about the name so much, but look at that weird thing. That is the flower down in here, right here. It's actually finished flowering. These are bracts that I'm not sure what they're there for. That's the flower there. Gorgeous little thing. Basically doesn't have any leaves. It's got photosynthetic stem. Maybe the bracts are actually, oh, there we go, a replacement for photosynthetic leaves. Weird, because they appear last in the growth of the plant. So anyway, weird plants. Here's another Centrolepis. You might have come across this one. This is a little bit more common, Centrolepis strigosa. Little hairy guy, again, badly photographed, hard to photograph. Cute little things, aren't they? So that's one plant. So sometimes they can get quite big. And they do this in that really short period of time. Crassulas are something that you probably will find in the footpath, the concrete footpath outside your house if you look hard enough. This is Crassula clossiana. Look at the colours again, beautiful coloration, red. You can see what's happening is the leaves that were supporting the photosynthesis of the plant, they start dying while the plant's flowering, because they're putting all that energy. They don't put it into roots and things, they're putting it, it's going the opposite way, into their flowers and seeds. They're just the cutest things. Better stop saying that, shouldn't I? Dorcas, this is in the carrot family, and you can see it's kind of like got a spiny fruit. Dorcas, we absolutely know is pollinated, it self-pollinates itself. It doesn't even open up to flower. So weirdly, this group of plants includes species that just don't even bother having sex with other plants. They just have it with themselves. Again, cute plant. Coloration's interesting, and there's a purpley red hue. Oh. Now, if you know about trigger plants, you might know about the grass trigger plant, Stylidium graminifolium. Well, here's a cute little annual called Stylidium dispectum. Isn't it just fantastic? And it has the same mechanism of all trigger plants, whereby this little arm here, you can almost see an arm in there, that winds itself back. Possibly an insect in this case does come along and it fires, and it's going to deposit pollen, hopefully on the back of the insect's back, and also pick up pollen from that insect having visited other individuals. Isn't that just the cutest thing? In the same family, Stylidiaceae, Levenhookia dubia. Isn't that just beautiful as well? Now, it doesn't have the triggering action. It's lost the trigger, but in many respects looks pretty similar. These are just fantastic. And if you've seen these before, hopefully you've appreciated them. If you haven't seen them before, it's really worth getting on your hands and knees and trying to seek them out, because they are just the best things. Work out how to use your phone camera, because you're going to need to work out how to photograph them, because they are challenging. As you can see in this photo, terrible photo, but this is one of the bluebells, Wallenbergia. Typically, we know of perennial Wallenbergia with big flowers. Well, this guy is an annual that's got tiny little flowers, Wallenbergia gracilentia. Another important family is the Cyperaceae. We're not going to get into the sedges, but it's a whole group of annual sedges. And you can see that they can be pretty successful in terms of the number of flowers they're producing from one individual that lives for only a few months. But let's move on from the Cyperaceae. They're not so interesting today. This is in the Portulaca family. So you can eat Portulaca. Calendrinia eremea. So these are like succulent plants. And so they, surprisingly, given they live for such a short amount of time, got really fleshy, sort of water-dense leaves. And these beautiful, beautiful flowers. They don't produce many flowers. They seem to produce more leaves than flowers, which is kind of at odds with what many of the other inch-flora are doing. Almost at the end of my expose of all these species. Oh, how good's this one? You might know Utricularia. They're the bladderworts. Bladderworts are normally perennial, and they're famous. The little bladder, basically, when it opens, it sucks in microorganisms into the bladder, and then it feeds off them. So it's a carnivorous plant. Here we've got an annual Utricularia, Tenella. Isn't that just fantastic? So these are really special places. If you find these are super, super special because they have, they're hard to find. They've got this particular species needs to be on wettish kind of cryptogamic crusts. They're hard to find. You've got to look really hard. When I found this one, the first time I'd ever seen this on the Victorian volcanic plains, I was pretty excited. It's like finding a new species or finding gold. It's like, wow, I'm so lucky to have seen this thing. Okay, of all those, you might have a favorite, but I'm gonna let you in on a secret about what my favorite is. So you might think you know what I'm gonna like here. You'll probably be wrong, but my gold medal goes to, I just think this is just a really spectacular plant, Nephosis. It's just so beautiful. It's just so unusual and curious. As I say, the flowers don't open up. That's it. And this that beautiful crystalline sort of structure of the leaves, and it's just, my goodness, it's just amazing little plant. So you might have your own favorite, and we might talk about that at the end, but they're all pretty amazing actually in their own right. And that's the point of tonight's talk, is to introduce you just to how amazing these things are. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of divert away now for a few minutes about what do we know about annuals, because surprisingly, we don't know very much, other than they live a short amount of time and they're pretty insignificant. So if you're interested, I'm happy to share, Adrian, this paper with you, and you can send it out to the group. Just, my goodness, it's now 12 years old. But 12 years ago, Terry and I decided to write one of the very first papers on the annual flora in semi-arid woodlands, many of which also occur on the Victorian volcanic plain, as it turned out. And so I'm going to just sort of touch base on what we learnt and what I've learnt since then. So what you might have seen today already is that this inch-flora doesn't seem to always hold. But that's actually partly true. Some inch plants are always strictly less, well, they're basically an inch. So on the left-hand side there, we've got Siloxerus, one of those cabbage-looking plants. They never, ever, ever get bigger than about 25 millimeters, an inch, surprisingly. On the right, we've got Dorcas, which is that carrot, native carrot, and they can range from a centimetre all the way up to probably 12 to 15 centimetres in height. And they vary according to how much water they've got access to, or perhaps how good a season it is. And that matters because when you're bigger, typically you're going to grow more flower heads or seed pods, basically. So some species are really variable. They can be an inch sometimes and not an inch later on. In fact, you'd be surprised to know that they're inch plants. When it comes to inch plants, there's basically two types of growth form. One that's simply erect, like the photo we can see here of Melotia, and they grow a single shoot. They only ever grow a single shoot. And they have one terminal flower. Stupid things. Like, why would you do that? Versus, you can be branched. So you germinate, and then you send out lots of horizontal branches that then curve upwards, and each of those branches will have one or more flowers on it, like we can see down in the bottom right there in Pognoepus. So that's one plant, and it's actually like acting like a pretty big kind of plant. And so they're investing their future in these different ways, and they must be successful in some years or better in some years than others. Now, maybe the erect form is always better on the drier end of the climate scale, and maybe the branch form is always better on the wetter end. But just be aware there's two types of growth here. And so it can flummox you when you do see them, when they in the field, you think that's not an inch plant. It's actually, it looks like a big perennial, and yet it's an inch plant. It probably doesn't surprise you that when these plants germinate, the first leaves that come out of the seed are called cotyledons. They're their first leaves. So a dicotyledon means there are two of those. That's our flowering plants. Monocotyledons, like grasses, they have just one. And just as they're unfolding, they're just coming out, they've already grown root systems that are 70 millimeters deep, 7 centimeters, before the leaves have even unfolded. So that tells you a lot about the inch-flora. They're all about putting roots down to get access to water, probably, because this is a vulnerable way to live. And then they go up. They have heaps and heaps of root branching. And so what they're trying to do is presumably fossick about for nutrients and water. But it can't be that in that very short amount of time that fossicking around for nutrients is going to be super successful. You're not alive for long enough to find many nutrients. So we've done some work that shows that many of these inch plants have associations with mycorrhizal fungi. So the fungi colonize the roots really quickly, and they then have this relationship between the plant and the fungi. Fungi is getting water and some nutrients, and the fungal network is massively increasing the foraging areas that were for nutrient uptake for the annual. So we actually think lots of annuals are successful because they hook into fungi straight away, mycorrhizal fungi. Lots still to be learnt about that, but we do know that seems to happen in some species at least. So there we've got an interaction going on. The seed biology is obviously really important in an annual because the seed is your currency, how successful you are. So if you're going to be an inch high, that presents some problems for dispersal. Clearly, it's not like you can fall to the ground and move very far. You're already at the ground. So many of these plants have quite elaborate fluffy bits attached to their seeds. So these are called, in this case, this is a pappus. These are both daisies, beautiful structures. And as it turns out, they're really good at being sucked up by updrafts. Think of we've all seen dandelion seeds, when we blow this dandelion flower and they go off they puff off into the atmosphere and they get taken off. The inch-flora is the same. Many of the daisies get sucked up by updraft, which is just those very sort of gentle zephyrs, as it were, that you get at certain times, when it's certain warmth and what have you, and it sucks these seeds up. And you only need to move tens of centimeters or meters, and you've been pretty successful at colonizing into new habitats. Your alternative is potentially to be transported by animals. We call this zoochory, so it's dispersal by animals. And so if you're going to do that, you need some barbs and hooks on your seeds. So this is actually the seed of the Dorcas, the little carrot we've been showing you. And so they have these little tiny barbs that must attach to goodness knows what, but little animals, and they get transported around. And here's one of the Brachyscomes purpusilla, we saw that earlier. And it's got these sort of elaborate edges here that possibly play the same sort of role. It's hard to know. The seeds are tiny, as you can see. Look at the scale, they're 2 millimeters. Yeah, they're tiny seeds. They're pretty hard to see being transported around the landscape. It's one of the joys of working on these types of plants. We just don't know what the hell they're doing. One thing they might be doing in some instances, and there's big question marks over this, is many of the habitats they exist in can flood in big rain events or wet years. And so their seeds might be transported around by what's called hydrochory, water. And that might be a really efficient way to transport what are smaller than grains of sand around the landscape. And that might only have to happen once a decade. And that's a pretty successful way of dispersing and finding new habitats. So it's something we don't know a great deal about. So if you're interested in doing some work on seed dispersal in the inch-flora, I'd welcome you into my lab anytime. It'd be fun, hard, but it'd be fun. But it doesn't stop there. What's really, really interesting is many of these inch-flora perform what we call a thing called mixospermy. It's the ability of a seed to produce mucilage upon hydration. So we can see in the front photo here, or front of the photo, These seeds have just been wetted up a few minutes ago, and they have this gelatinous layer. It just emerges out of the seed. That's really, really important, we think, and I'll point out in a moment why, but really important in a lot of inch-flora. By contrast, here's that sticky long beaks I talked about before, had the really tiny flowers, and then it went a long way down to the ovaries. You can see now why, because this is the seed, which would have been the ovary, and this long fluffy bit was the pappus that allows it then to disperse. Right? Look, they look like helicopters. So they get picked up and transported really readily. But getting back to mixospermy is really, really important because, as I said before, lots of these annuals live where there are crusts. So lichens and mosses and stuff. So they're not on bare ground, they're actually growing on top of another plant. And so mixospermy means that once you get wetted up by rainfall and you turn all mucilaginous and sticky, that holds you on the crust, which is really, really important because to push your root through those lichens and mosses actually requires quite a lot of force. So if you're stuck to the soil, that means you've got something to lever off. The root comes out and then it can get into the soil because it's actually stuck like glue on top of the surface of the soil. Might also be important because when it becomes all gooey like that, it basically acts like a wick and it draws moisture out of the ground. And that means as soon as that plant starts germinating, it's got a reliable source of water to keep it going. The worst thing these species could do is germinate, it gets dry, and they will die. Like that's very vulnerable for them. So these are just really fascinating plants. Not many other plants are mixospermous. So there's something going on here that this is advantaging these really curious little plants. And here's just a scanning electron microscope image showing a seed. And I just put it in here. This goo here it's wetted up over this side over here. And you can see how it's just all going gooey. And all these, whatever the hell these things, this is the seed here, if you don't know what you're looking at. So it's dry here. This is what it looks like when it's dry. And as it wets up, these things just start gooing up. I really don't have a terminology for this. They're really fascinating. We don't know much about mixospermy at all anywhere in the world. And yet there's a whole bunch of species on our doorstep that do it. So there's another fascinating topic to go and study if you know something about seed biology and you're interested in that. Sounds like I'm advertising for lots of students, but I am, and you're never too old to start. Many of you might think that digging animals and annual plants, inch-flora, would be really connected. But of course, we don't know because most of our ground-dwelling animals disappeared ages ago in the 1800s. So many of the bandicoots and all the other digging animals. We can get some hints down in Tasmania, but there are not many inch-flora down in Tasmania, so we can't actually make the comparison. But we might think that digging by animals would bring seeds up to the soil disturbance would promote germination of these annual plants, and it probably did. So we might have lost a niche in grasslands because of the loss of animals. But we don't know anything about this, so here's a big unknown. But one thing we do know is that if you're going to live for 12 weeks of the year, you have to survive the other 40 weeks of the year by being dormant as a seed in the soil. And so annual plants, unsurprisingly, they have lots of seed stored in the soil in what we call a soil seed bank. So the question becomes, if you've got lots of seed in the soil, what makes you germinate? Like, what's the cue that makes you germinate? Because once you decide to germinate as an annual, there's no going back. For a mountain ash tree, once you germinate, and if you die, it doesn't really matter because you've got mum who might live for 350 years as your insurance. In an annual, they can't afford to waste their seed. So we might make a hypothesis that the seasonal pattern in our part of the world of high summer temperatures and low rainfall combines to make these species dormant. And the plants have to have that dormancy overcome before they germinate. So this phase here becomes really, really critical to understand. So I'm going to just run you through the only piece of data really in the whole talk, but hopefully you will bear with me. It's really fascinating stuff. So focus on the left-hand side, we've got 10 inch-flora, and we're going to expose them to different types of treatments to see what makes them germinate. So if we've got seed and it typically might disperse in early summer, will they germinate if you expose them to 30-degree temperatures in a growth cabinet? So very artificial, with 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark. For 9 of the 10 species, the answer was no. But strangely, for one, Balaenospora, they germinate really well at high temperatures. So that's just weird. So they don't seem to have any dormancy. So that makes them vulnerable because you germinate in summer, you're probably going to die. Okay, so if we take all those seeds that were at 30 degrees and we now move them to 20 degrees, so we're going to take them down in temperature. It's as if they're coming out of summer and they're going into autumn. What happens? Okay, not much. One species, Calandrinia, that little portulaca type plant, germinates, but all the others don't. And we've already tested the Balaenospora, so we didn't worry about testing it again. They've already germinated. So now 8 out of 10 have still not germinated. So just coming out of summer and going into autumn wasn't enough in our experiment to make them germinate. That seems odd. You'd think it would, because we just add water, it's 20 degrees, they should germinate. So what if we then add a hormone called gibberellic acid? We know that gibberellic acid can be a cue for germination in many plant species, particularly vegetable species. We know this. We can cue things to germinate. So let's add it at 20 degrees. So we're just taking the same seed. They haven't germinated yet. We'll just add this thing now. What happens? Well, a couple more germinate, but one's quite minimally, but 2 germinated okay. So that just tells me there's some chemical cue necessary for them to germinate. So we've been pretty unsuccessful at germinating these inch-flora, and yet they come up by the thousands in the field. So we thought, what's another thing we should do? So what if we take the seed, put it in an oven, not your domestic oven. You don't want to keep your oven on for 4 weeks continuously at 35 degrees. You'll kill the oven probably. So in a oven at university here, let's put them at 35 degrees so we dry them out. So we're telling the seed it's warm, it's dry, and then you go and put them in 20 degrees and you add water. What happens? They all germinate, except, interestingly, the central epis, which we still haven't really germinated very well. So this tells us these plants are tracking the environment, but they need to go through what's called dry stratification. They need to dry out as seeds. They need to go through a hot summer, and then they're primed, ready to germinate with the first autumn rains at 20 degrees, if you like. So right about now, actually. So I think that's just fascinating again as well, that these plants know they're going through summer. So wet summers might be rather problematic for these species if they don't go through this dry stratification. Don't know that, but anyway, that's something we might postulate. Just to link why that's important. If you look at, this is just an old graph from a paper from a long time ago from Western Australia, doesn't really matter, using halictrums, they've changed their name. And it just talks about when they germinate, when they start flower, or when they first initiate flowers, and when they're flowering. That's just what these little things are at the top. But link it to the rainfall. So in Perth, obviously it doesn't rain at all over summer, very Mediterranean climate. We get some initial rainfall and bang, the plant germinates in this particular year and grows and flowers. Didn't need much follow-up. Then nothing much happens. There's no rain in this environment. This is a really extreme example, obviously. Let's get to the second year. We get to about the same time of year. It's a little bit later. It's in April this year, not March. No, it was May. It's a bit earlier, actually. And bang, we get a rainfall event. Bang, they germinate and then they die, flower. Then it demonstrates why they need to go through this dry stratification. In this particular year, there's lots of rain in summer, January, February, March, and yet there's no germination. It could be too high, the temperatures of the air, or the plants haven't been through their dry stratification. So bang, we get to, in this case, May, it rains, bang, they all germinate. And we see some follow-up rainfall events that mean it can probably grow for a bit longer than it did in the first year. My point there is just like, these plants are all about, they're taking risks in the sense of they've got a limited window for germination, but there's no risk whatsoever because they're so well in tune with their environment. It's really amazing biology, actually. So as we get to the end of the talk, I just wanted to touch on, well, why do I care about this? Or why should you care about this? Well, I think this is where the rubber hits the road. Of the 34 annual forbs, remember they're the wildflower type of inch-flora, observed on the Victorian volcanic plain before 1935. So it's still more than, it's about 100 years of European settlement of this country. We haven't seen 47% of them in the recent decade, in the last many decades. We might actually think they have gone missing from this flora. So this has been silent extinctions from the Victorian volcanic plains. They're not extinct in the wild everywhere, but from this landscape, they have gone extinct and they've been wiped from our memory. They've been erased from any sort of memory that they even existed in these ecosystems. If you want to follow up this kind of stuff, again, Adrian, I can send you this paper and you can share it with the group. Steve Sinclair and I and others a couple of years ago just wrote a paper where we documented this, the forgotten annual forbs of Victoria's basalt plains grasslands, whereby we looked at herbarium records, we used lots of expert opinion, and we came to the conclusion that about half of this group had never been seen in the last 2 or 3 decades. Which ones? Well, there they are. Not global extinctions, but loss from the Victorian volcanic plains. This one, Hyalosperma praecox, was only ever known from Skipton. So it was always perhaps not really a true member of the Victorian volcanic plains. But I think that's sad that we've lost a bunch of species from the VVP and didn't even realise it. Why did this happen? I'm just about done, Adrian. It could be the loss of soil digging animals. Yeah, maybe it's not enough fire in these grasslands. They would have been traditionally burnt by Aboriginal people, and then in early days anyway, probably uncontrolled burning by graziers. Take fire out of the system, you get lots of grass growth, and there's no habitat for these species anymore. Perhaps in some places there's been too much fire. It's actually really curious that the inch-flora is largely absent from annually burnt roadsides in Western Victoria. And yet those roadsides would be the best examples of VVP plains grasslands. So maybe they get burnt too often, they get wiped out. Probably more likely it's loss of their unique habitat to invasion by exotic annual grasses. So on the left, beautiful grassland, red soil grassland, lots of space for inch-flora. On the right, there's a weed invaded grassland where there's not much habitat remaining. That's probably closer to the truth. So any recovery of these species has to think about what it's growing with. So could we bring these species back? Well, we might ask 3 questions, or 4 really. Are there any seeds left in the soil? Probably not from what we can tell. What are the disturbances that promote annuals? We're not really sure. What about the invasive species? Yeah, they're probably really important. So until we get rid of those. And then how does 2 and 3 interact? If you're going to have disturbances by small ground digging animals, is that just going to promote the exotics? Probably. So it's a pretty challenging thing to come up with of how would you return these species to these ecosystems. But I think we should. So to conclude, hopefully you've got a bit more of an insight about this much neglected group of small and beautiful plants. They do contribute both in numbers, but just in sort of the sheer numbers of individuals to ecosystems, but also in the diversity more generally. And yet we have basically just not even seen this happen. And we've got lots to learn. So my take-home message is annual plants are something that I think we should be paying much more attention to, not only on the Victorian volcanic plains, but ecosystems elsewhere in southeastern Australia to understand how are they faring and how might they fare under changing climates. We've lost heaps already, but let's find places where we can work out how to maintain them in densities like this one. So with that, Adrian, I better end with a minute to go, and I was hoping to finish much earlier than that, so sorry about that.
Oh, thank you very much, John. That was absolutely cracking, needless to say. It's our eyes have truly been opened. I can see there are lots of questions in the chat. I've got plenty of my questions myself. Does anyone, before we get to the chat, want to put up their hand and ask a question? Is that the easiest way of going? We have so many.
I think so, Adrian. And then if there are no questions, we might just go into the chat box as well. So So Rosemary, I'll forward on those two papers to you, Adrian, and maybe you can disseminate them, Adrian. I'm more
That
than
would be
happy to do that.
fantastic.
Otherwise,
I'd
they're
love
hidden
to do
behind
that.
paywalls and things.
Yes, great. Michael Trenor, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. Thanks, John. I just wondered, when you were talking about, obviously, about the size, is grazing also a factor here in their, or either their protection or their loss? Obviously, it might depend on the size of the herbivore, but things like rabbits and the like could have led to a reduction due to their size.
Yep, that's a really good question, Michael. So we should just go back 35,000 years ago. There were diprotodons wandering around. So, but of course, they would have been munching with kangaroos and what have you at relatively patchy low densities. So it may well be simply that by having hundreds of thousands of sheep in these habitats and just eating them every single year, at some point you run out of seed in the soil to germinate from because you keep getting eaten. And that could be the slow decline. I actually think that's probably closest to the truth, that these things would faithfully germinate. Sure, some would have been eaten by native animals back in the day, but not like they would when sheep colonise these lands. And if you keep stopping seed production, at some point, I think, yeah, you just get knocked out. So maybe the shorter you are, you're more likely to persist. That's a really good hypothesis. Big tall ones might have been the ones that disappeared first. Or you've just given me an idea, and it's amazing. It's such an obvious idea, Michael, but I could go back over my data and say, okay, which of the ones that persist in grazed paddocks versus, if you like, less grazed paddocks? And I reckon you'd probably find it's the short ones that are persisting in the grazed paddocks.
Mm.
So I think your hypothesis is a good starting point.
I'll come and put my hand up to be to do research.
That'd be awesome.
Thanks, John.
No, thank you.
John, do any of these have endangered status? Are they critically endangered or in
Some
EPBC listed?
Yeah, there are some, and I'm thinking of one, and it's great because it's the only plant in the Victorian flora that starts with Q. The genus starts with Q, Quinetia, and it's called zigzag plant. It grows in a zigzag way, and that's highly endangered because its distribution is really narrow. And I just love the fact that it's the only genus that starts with Q. So that's why it's easy. Yeah, so some of these, definitely that Hyalosperma praecox, it was one of the white paper daisies, is on the listing. I can't remember which level. I think what we would find, Adrian, like many lists, we probably haven't realised that some of these things have disappeared, or we don't know what their status is. In fact, I just showed that of those 16 species, 47% of annuals that have disappeared from the VVP. Don't really know how they're doing elsewhere either. Actually, we just know we haven't seen them for decades. And so maybe some are really obvious and yet they'll be fine. There'll be others, like the little annual stylidium, that I think that could actually be on a list. I think that's actually probably quite threatened, that we just don't know much about.
Part of the problem is that when all those conservation statuses were reviewed a few years ago, it was simply based on what was currently listed and also what was on the old flora advisory lists, which went back to about 2005, strictly speaking. So an awful lot of the current conservation statuses are based on really rotten and old and out of date information. So there's a strong argument for reviewing a lot of these things that have just never been properly considered.
Yeah, and just to go on that, Vanessa, there's a guy called Wenck, W-E-N-K, early collector. We're talking the 1800s. He collected lots of these inch-flora on the VVP, and they've rarely been collected since. So they may well have disappeared because of grazing or whatever, changes in fire regime, whatever it might be. And we didn't come along for another 100 years before we started getting interested in this topic and never even knew these species existed. And so I think there's a bit of blindness there in terms of what's your benchmark or what's your starting point for the flora. And I think what we've shown here is for annuals, that a lot of them have disappeared already before we even knew they existed.
Peter, you have your hand up.
Yes, John. I was going to ask you, for a couple of years, I worked at Melton Botanic Gardens on a VVP plains grassland bed out there. And you're right, one of the biggest problems was the exotic weeds and trying to get rid of those before you grow the natives. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on the best way to do that. I tried to dig them out, which was a huge task, and then they ended up spraying them, which I'm not sure if that was a great thing. But anyway, what your thoughts about it?
Peter, I mean, if you had your time over again, I'd say scalp off the topsoil or whatever, get rid of that layer of soil that had all those weeds and what have you, but we missed that opportunity. But that would be a good thing, because if you go back to a barer earth, as it were, a bit further down the subsoil, that's, you know, they like these kind of environments as long as they don't get recolonized by exotics. Yeah, I don't have any magical solutions to this problem, because those weeds are so intractable at times that outside of spraying to get rid of them, I mean, again, how long do you do that before you actually even see a shift to these tiny plants, actually? I think what I would recommend, Peter, is you start in places that are a bit easier to start with. So one of the places you might find these is under, you know, how you get sugar gums or any tree really on the VBP, creates a halo underneath it in terms of it, you know, reduces the water. Often it's pretty sparsely grassed and what have you. I suspect that's a really good habitat for these inch-flora, provided it's not so dry under there, there's no moisture whatsoever. But the reason for that is because they're a bit challenging for plant growth, and these little annuals, provided they get enough moisture, and this might be a good year for them, you know, they only need that window, a 12-week window, as it were, to be successful. So I reckon maybe it's where we would look to put them back would be places that are just sparser to start with.
Lorian Francis has a question in the chat. She asks if some of these plants are entirely self-pollinated. Do they have any genetic variation, or are they just clones? And how on earth do they survive and evolve?
That's a great question, because if they're just selfing, that means they're not transferring pollen, but that doesn't mean they're not mutating. And so mutations happen, like that's where it just goes wrong, if you like. And because these little heads will often produce 50 to 100 little seeds, you only need mutations happening, and remember there's hundreds, if not thousands of these plants, mutations happening even every year. You know, one seed in one plant, you know, out of 10 or out of 100 might introduce a different, therefore, genetic code into that population. And a lot of the time they might disappear because they're not very successful. But you're actually, the trade-off is that you're producing heaps of seeds, so you're not reliant on an insect or some pollinator, because you're likely to be unsuccessful most of the time. Having said that, you think way back to the start of my talk, those big pussy tails that were growing in the desert, they're clearly all about trying to attract pollinators. They're big, they're showy, they're obvious. They want to get a bee into them. And so they, in their case, they've gone the opposite way. They're saying, look at me. Look at me. These little inch-flora, though, they're hard to find for anything other than something the size of like a midge, or, you know, little tiny, tiny little things. So it's a really good question. Again, we don't know much about this, but they must be successful, because if you think about it, where they're doing well, you know, there are hundreds of thousands in some cases of these little inch plants in a hectare. I often make my students count how many there are, not in a hectare, but in a square meter. And we get into the hundreds, you know, and so they can actually be super successful where the conditions are right, you know, the habitat is correct, all that sort of stuff. We just have lost most of that because it's gone under the plough, gone under the grazing thing. I see Catherine, she voted for the little stylidium as her most favourite. I'm glad someone's put their neck out. That would have been a close second for me as well, I reckon.
So, John, do you collect the seed for these? Do you have a little seed production area for it? Just all of that?
The problem is, yeah, you got to, I mean, the seed production area is about that tall. They're actually, so all you do is you just harvest the whole damn plant. It's like mowing the lawn. You just mow the whole lot, and you've got a lot of rubbish in there, but you've got all the seeds. Well, there's no way you can go around picking all these. Well, you can, but you're not going to get many. You'll spend half an hour and get 100 little heads or something, you know, like it's, yeah, they germinate pretty easily. Someone asked, I saw it come up in the chat box, do they need mycorrhizae to germinate? No, they don't. They seem to germinate pretty easily. And so I think where the mycorrhizae come in is how successful they might be. And I suspect, without knowing this at all, that might explain why some of them are the same species, that this is really short or really tall. Maybe some of those hook into mycorrhizae and therefore they can grow really big, whereas other ones are always just uniformly always small. So again, we don't know much, really.
Other questions, people? There must be lots.
There's heaps in the chat box, and I'd love you to save them or something, Adrian, and I could answer them at some future point.
Yes, we can do that. That
I don't know
sounds
I'm
good.
giving myself a lot of work, I think. But
Indeed. Can I just ask too about ecosystem function? Like they obviously look after themselves very well, but what do they have a broader role? Like, are they great food for beetles or?
Good question again, Adrian. Don't know, but you'd imagine all that seed out there. Surely things eat it. Surely, you know, that's a resource that shouldn't be anyway. You wouldn't think would be passed up by seed eaters. You would think. Invariably, they don't have much leaf matter, so they're not really good for herbivores, you know, grasshoppers and things. It's actually really interesting. The grasshoppers don't emerge, or they're not around at the same time that the annuals are doing their thing, so they're out of sync. So I think it would be seed eaters. I would think. What's their ecosystem role? I don't know, just to be there.
John, I've had a fit. My impression has been that you get so many more annuals up on the northern plains. Is that your feeling as well? And if so, would you have your impression as to why?
Yes, Vanessa. So in the northern plains grasslands, probably because the vegetation is sparser to start with, so
Yeah,
there's more
exactly.
available habitat.
Yeah.
There is a very strongly seasonal environment up there. It does get super dry. You know, it is very Mediterranean, if you like, compared to the VVP. There is not necessarily more diversity up there, which is really interesting. Yes, the individuals you find them might be in their thousands, and I think that's just habitat availability. But there's actually, as it turns out, on the VVP, an equivalent diversity, if not higher diversity of species. Lots of the species I showed today don't occur on the northern plains. You know, that's super interesting. So maybe it's too stressful up there, like the rainfall is too marginal for some of those species. But I think it would probably be around habitat availability. It's just a sparser, certainly there's a lot more red soil grassland, so it's just sparser.
Yeah. So might you get more to sort of the drier end of the VVP, so more in the rain shadows, sort of Keel or Werribee plains?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So unfortunately, settlement around Melbourne happened really early on to the Keel plains and what have you. So that drier plains country and heading out west towards Balan and what have you, the bull oak kind of country, you would expect to have more annuals, and by and large, it does relative to the Hamilton end, which is a much wetter grassland on the VVP. It's much higher rainfall, it's 200 millimetre higher rainfall. So they are more clustered closer to Melbourne on the VVP, like the Keilor Plains, you're right there. Again, red soils, lots of beautiful red soils out that way, and you get lots of annuals. But unfortunately, you know, that's where the burgeoning growth corridors are, and probably in the Western Plains grasslands, you know, no one's even thought about, well, what about habitat for annuals? I mean, it's just been completely usurped by the exotics. And maybe we should be thinking about, well, how do we return annuals that would have been part of this flora for their conservation purposes back to those landscapes? I think that would be a bit of a challenge.
God, we're just trying to hang on to whatever we've got, let alone introducing stuff.
Well, let's have a vision. Yeah. G'day, Michael. You've got another question?
Yeah, sorry. Is the size and I suppose the diversity here analogous with the alpine or subalpine flora? For
so interestingly, Michael, there are no. Well, that's not quite true. There's, I think, 2 annuals in the alpine flora. One of the reasons being, it can snow on any day of the year in the Alps. You know, you can get frost any day of the year. So I think, and having sex in the Alps probably is pretty uncomfortable. So it's a really challenging environment, the Alps, for annual plants. I suspect, you know, out of season frosts or snow dumps, you know, which might dump 30 centimetres and you're under snow for a week, that could be the difference between you surviving and not, you know. So as it turns out, the diversity in the alpine area of annuals is close to 0, which almost kind of makes sense. Up there, you've got to be slow growing and long lived, you know, to kind of get through the cold environment.
No, thank you.
You're welcome. Adrian, it's 7:45. We should let these good people go, I think, if
I
they've got
think
no
we
further
probably should
questions.
get on with our Grassy Plains Network meeting, but can we all say thank you very much to John for his incredible talk. That was fabulous.
Thank-
and
thank
we
you.
will
Thank you, everyone, for
circulate the
coming.
chat.
Thanks,
and,
John.
Thanks,
And then-
John. That was really good fun. Great
Thanks
to
for
see you.
everyone for coming.
Great stuff.
Hopefully you
Thank
love
you.
this stuff a bit more now.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Indeed.
Thanks.